Chapter 21. The new world would have been perfect for Tanner. And it. A world with no electricity, cars, global networks, factories, nor all the pollution they cause. He would have loved it. After all, he was one of the world's most influential climate change activists. Millions of social media followers, countless guest appearances on top talk shows and podcasts. You name it, he did it. He even had a book deal. Someone else ghostwrote it. Still, it had his name and photo on the cover, and it was his signature that people lined up to receive. The fame wasn't something he ever expected or even planned. As a kid growing up in Los Angeles, he was enamored by the city's famous smog. With each passing year, as he learned more and more about the environment and pollution, he became more fascinated. The fascination evolved into frustration, then anger. When social media began to take off, he simply started shouting his thoughts into the void. At first, no one paid any mind. Then, a few scattered likes, comments, and shares. Then more, and more. 100 followers, 1,000 followers, 5,000, 10,000, 50,000, 100,000, 500,000, 1 million. The number just kept climbing, and as his exposure grew, so did his influence. People were listening to him, actually listening. He was flown around the world in private jets to attend conferences, speak at panels, and lead protests. His fame also opened the door to plenty of sex. He enjoyed every bit of it. After all, sex was natural. Plenty of people tried to discredit him for his lack of education and experience, and they were not wrong. None of that mattered to his followers. As long as he kept telling them what they wanted to hear, he could do no wrong in their eyes. On the night of the Great Mix-Up, he was back home in Los Angeles. 48 hours earlier, he had led a protest in London. Now he was home and needed rest after 2 lengthy private jet flights. He was on the couch, watching a movie and drinking designer bottled water with his eyes half open. Next thing he knew, he was standing amid a massive crowd, in the body of a young girl in her early 20s. He had just a moment to observe his new body and those around him before all hell broke loose. He and all the people around him were decked out in the same colors. Then he looked past the crowd around him and saw the field, a football field. He was in the student section of a packed college football game. The moment before all hell broke loose had passed. All hell was in fact breaking loose. It is a known fact that every major city in the world was consumed in the hours following the Great Mix-Up. But one didn't have to be in a major city to experience major city chaos. One simply needed to be amidst a large crowd. 80,000 people packed into a stadium was a powder keg. Tanner never stood a chance. His new, small, frail frame was quickly swept up in the chaos and violence. His new head was smashed into the back of a seat while it was still trying to get a handle on what was happening. As he lay on the concrete bleeding out while being trampled, his damaged brain failed to connect thoughts, and within minutes he was dead. One of the most beloved and influential climate change activists the world had ever known died face down in a puddle of blood that was both his own and someone else's in a college football stadium. The body would never move. It would rot and decay and turn to dust in that very spot, then blow away on the wind. Had he survived, Tanner would have loved the new world. Had he jumped into a strong, healthy body in a low population area, he would have created a new life for himself and thrived for years. But he wasn't one of the lucky ones. Chapter 22. The garden was really coming in this year. She had never been a gardener in the old world. It wasn't that she didn't have any interest. She had plenty of interest. She simply never had the time. Other things were more important, namely school and her relationship. Those 2 things had been enough to keep her both busy and satisfied. Rendering a hobby like gardening was nothing more than something that seemed like it could be fun someday. Now she had more free time than she ever thought she would have, and that someday had been today for a long time. The gardening also served as a good distraction from what was happening out west. the war. She was against reclamation, but no one had asked her. All she could do was remain safe behind the walls, distract herself with gardening, and treat any wounded soldiers who came back. She wasn't too concerned about the fighting making its way to her doorstep. It was all just so unnecessary. The idea that organized territorial warfare would be a reality seemed impossible 15 years prior, back when the only thing that mattered in the new world was survival. Things change fast. In a strange bolt of luck, when everything changed over, she was dropped into a man's body just over 1,000 miles from home. A stone's throw compared to how many people fared. It had been a small farming region in what used to be called the state of Iowa. Her new body was that of a man in his mid-30s with broad shoulders and a large, once muscular former football player build that had since turned into what some used to call a dad bod. He had been sitting on the couch, drinking beer and watching football when things changed over. That was where she found herself, sitting on an old, worn couch in the body of a man, with a cheap beer in her hand and football on the TV. The sudden change of going from dancing at her wedding to being in the body of a man on a couch in a farmhouse somewhere in the middle of nowhere, Iowa, was one thing. What she saw on the TV was another. It would be a bit before the power grid went down. Therefore, the football game was still broadcasting. It was one of those big, important college football games with tens of thousands of people in the crowd, and they were going crazy. Sarah sat on that couch too shocked by what was on the TV to worry about the new body she was in. Most of the people on TV were either climbing over each other to escape or viciously attacking one another. She even took a sip of the cheap beer that was in her new hand. It was nowhere near as good as the champagne she had just been drinking at her own wedding. Despite no longer being in her real body, she swore she could still taste that champagne on her lips. As the scene at the football game continued to descend into deeper madness, she heard the loud groan of a plane overhead flying far too low. So low it shook the old farmhouse. The house rattled, and a framed picture slid from the wall, its glass spiderwebbing upon contact with the floor. A few moments later, the air all around her choked with the sound of an explosion. The house shook again, even more violently. More pictures fell from the walls. A glass bounced off the kitchen table and shattered on the linoleum floor. This rocked her from her dazed state and got her off the couch. For the first time, she took stock of her new body, her newfound size and strength. Then she lumbered out the door to find a ball of flames illuminating the farm fields. Luckily, those fields had already been harvested, and there was no crop to burn. But the jet fuel was enough to keep the fire going for some time. The heat from the fire caused her to sweat. The smoke caused her to cough and gasp for fresh air. Seeing the fire also helped kick her physician instincts into gear. She was about to run toward it in search of survivors when she was knocked down to the ground from behind. She rolled over and looked up to find a very pregnant woman wearing nothing but a large t-shirt and underwear staring down at her. The pregnant woman screamed words at Sarah, but she couldn't understand them since they were in another language, a language she didn't recognize. The woman was at least 8 months pregnant, looked as if she was going to go into labor at any moment. Sarah simply stared up at her in shock, unsure of what to do. The woman continued to scream as she clutched her belly and fell to her knees while coughing up blood. Sarah got up and approached her. "Lift up your shirt." The woman did nothing other than growl in pain, more blood gurgling from her mouth. Sarah pushed the woman's arms away and lifted the shirt, and what she saw caused her to stumble back and vomit up the cheap beer and mac and cheese the farmer must have eaten earlier. She could see the baby moving inside the woman's womb. Not your typical kicking. The baby was clawing at the inside of the womb, fighting to get out. The poor woman, in more pain than Sarah had ever seen anyone in, began convulsing, and went from coughing up bits of blood to vomiting streams of it. She gurgled more unintelligible words through the blood that was pouring from her mouth as she fell to her side and continued to convulse. Sarah wanted more than anything to help her, to put all those years of medical school to work. But there was no playbook for this scenario. All she could do was watch as the baby clawed the woman to death from the inside. Once the woman's insides had had enough and she succumbed to the baby's onslaught. The baby struggled for a few more minutes, but without its mother to keep it alive, its life faded, and it too died. Catching her breath, Sarah turned away from the dead woman and was reminded of the fiery plane crash some 300 yards away. She jogged until she was as close to the wreckage as she could get before it was too hot and the smoke was too thick. Some charred bodies had been thrown from the plane and had probably been dead since impact. The rest were still on board, burning to ash. There was no one she could save. There was no one at all. She still had no true grasp on what was happening, but she had a good idea, and was glad to be alone on a farm in the middle of nowhere. Despite what she had just witnessed, things could have been worse. They could have been much worse. Over the coming days, weeks, and months, they would get worse. Eventually, they would get better. She spent her first 3 days on the farm in a trance. She needed time to get a grasp on the situation, get mildly used to her new body, and prepare for what was waiting for her in this strange, mixed-up new world. Even though she had no desire to stay, she was smart enough to recognize that winter was at the door and that nothing awaited her out there but chaos and misery. So, she resigned herself to hunkering down for a few months and using the time to prepare for her journey home. There was plenty to do. The first thing she did was bury the poor pregnant woman in a nearby field. She wanted to say some words, but none came. She didn't even bother marking it. After all, no one was coming to visit. Then she needed to figure out where the hell she was. A farm. That was all she knew. It narrowed things down a bit, but not much. She found the wallet of the man whose body she now inhabited on his dresser. That was when she first learned that she had landed in what was once known as Iowa. All things considered, not bad. All it took was the sight of the madness at the football game, the plane crash, and the person in the pregnant woman's body speaking a foreign language for her to understand that people's minds had scattered into bodies all across the world. Getting sent to Iowa was nothing. It was maybe even a blessing. She found an old paper road map in the glove box of the man's truck and would use it to plot her course home. That was winter work, though. There were other priorities to deal with first. Namely, guns. She needed to be armed and ready, not only for the eventual journey home, but for protection in case anyone came to the farm looking for trouble. Lucky for her, there was a cache of guns spread throughout the house. The man whose body she now resided in surely had no interest in gun safety. Bedroom closet, 3 guns. Dresser, 1 gun. Garage, 4 guns. Barn, 6 guns. Truck glove box, 1 gun. Wife's SUV glove box, 1 gun. On and on and on it went. None were locked away. Worked out well for her, though, considering all she had seen both on the television and within the immediate radius of the farm. This was not the kind of world where you wanted to travel both alone and unarmed. She gathered up every gun she could find and brought them to the living room where she laid them out. She then brought all the ammunition she could find, which was more than enough. Each gun was picked up and tested out. She checked the weights, then took aim and pretended to shoot. Once she had settled on the finalists, she spent some time learning how they worked. After all, she'd never fired a gun before. She'd seen plenty of movies, not nearly enough to make her an expert, but enough for her to fake her way through it. After all, she was a doctor. If she could make it through medical school, she surely could figure out how a gun works. It took a while, but she did get the hang of it. It was louder than she expected, and the kickback much harder. But she could handle it. Plus, having the farmer's strong frame helped. After testing all the finalists, she landed on a 9mm handgun, a classic shotgun, and a good old-fashioned AR-15. She'd seen enough of them on the news over the years to know how effective they could be. Once she felt comfortable with the guns, she loaded those she liked best and strategically placed them throughout the house, just in case. Next, she took stock of the food. The farmer liked to think ahead. He had plenty of canned food, both in the house's pantry and in a nearby storm cellar. She would be well fed throughout the winter. It would be a long, cold winter, but overall uneventful. She would never need to use any of the guns as no one came knocking. The cold saw to that. She put a massive dent in the food supply, started and ran the truck every day to keep it fresh, read cheesy romance novels that had belonged to the farmer's wife, and did her best to stay warm by the fireplace. That was the hardest part, staying warm. Without the convenience of modern heating, she had to rely on layers and always having a fire going. And it was a cold winter. She mostly stayed inside, only going outside to start the truck every day. The farm didn't have a garage. She had moved the truck into a barn, but the walk from the house to the barn and back was something to dread. During the coldest nights, she often thought of the people out there not as prepared as she. How many people wouldn't survive to see spring? Once the snow melted, the days extended and the temperatures began to rise. She packed up the truck with necessities like food, clothes, and weapons. Then she searched the house for a memento, or treasure, as she and her husband liked to call them, something to commemorate her time there. She eventually settled upon some old military medals in a box in the closet. There was a variety from both World War II and the Vietnam War, likely belonging to the father and grandfather of the man whose body she now inhabited. These will look good on the shelves, she thought. She wasn't looking forward to the journey, but she was certainly looking forward to the destination, home. She took one last look at the farm, then fired up the truck and began heading east. By her estimation, it was sometime in early May when she finally hit the road. The weather had cleared 3 weeks earlier in what used to be Iowa, but she had no way of knowing how things were shaping up across the rest of the route, so she waited a few weeks just in case. Something she debated upon heavily in the days and weeks leading up to her departure was whether it would be wiser to travel under the cover of night or out in the open during the day. She eventually decided upon night. Having spent the previous months in total isolation, she could not be certain of how chaotic the new world was. She imagined complete lawlessness no matter what hour of the day. May as well have darkness on her side. Her route home had been carefully crafted with the help of the map she found in the farmer's glove box. Every night for nearly a week, she sat by the fire, studying little lines that represented roads and made certain of the most efficient and theoretically safest route. Thoughts of her father drifted through her mind during those route planning sessions. If not for him, the task would have been much more difficult. After all, she had lived her entire adult life with GPS. There had never been the need to use a map when the app on her phone did everything for her. Yet, she had rarely used GPS. Instead, pre-mix-up Sarah would look up the route online before leaving, then rely on her memory and sense of direction to get there. For more complex directions, she would jot down some notes by hand. Her father was to thank for this. Her family took plenty of road trips when she was a child during the pre-GPS age. In the nights leading up to those trips, her father would sit at the kitchen table drinking beer while poring over a map to determine the best route. Being an intelligent, curious child, young Sarah had found this fascinating and liked to sit at the table and watch. He was happy to share his thoughts, explain what he was doing, and answer any questions. When she got a little older, into the 9-10 range, her father would buy her a map of her own and they would plan the route together as a team. Then she would sit in the back seat with her map and act as a navigator. The skills learned during those years came in handy throughout adulthood. When she and her eventual husband would go treasure hunting or on road trips of their own, they would ignore GPS and instead rely on her to lead the way. On the night of the Great Mix-Up, a few hours before everything changed over, her father even brought those old road trips up during his wedding toast. When she was a little girl, Sarah was always asking me where to go, but as she grew up, she stopped asking and began plotting her own course. It's led her to so many great places. It led her here, and I can't wait to see where she goes next. 4 months later, Sarah was stranded on a farm in what used to be Iowa, sitting at a table with a map in front of her while planning the last road trip she would ever take. She made certain to avoid major population centers and use a combination of expressways and side roads. The Great Mix-Up occurred at night in what used to be America. Not so late that roads would be entirely empty, but late enough so they wouldn't be packed either. She wasn't too concerned about the expressways being clear. She was both right and wrong. A lot of people who jumped into bodies of people who were driving had not been able to grasp the situation before crashing. Either that, or they were young and had no idea how to drive. Luckily, many crashes were of the single car variety. Someone lost control, veered off the road, and crashed into a tree or a ditch or a barrier, etc. Even though there was plenty of wreckage along the roads, much of it was either off to the side or off the road completely. Sometimes she had to leave the road to get around a flipped semi-truck or small pileup. For the most part, she cruised along the empty and desolate stretches with peace and ease. Rarely did she see a living soul, and never did she stop to chat. She did get shot at a few times. There were also those who tried to flag her down to stop. Occasionally, she saw other cars. Not once did she look over at the person driving or their passengers. Instead, she pretended not to see them. She always kept her 9mm handgun loaded and within reach. The only times she exited the expressway were to go around high population centers. The more people around, the more opportunity for something bad to happen. The route she took from what used to be Iowa to what used to be North Carolina bypassed all major cities, but there were a handful of smaller ones along the way. While passing them from a safe distance, she could still see the unmistakable signs of chaos, death, and destruction. Since there was nothing on the radio, she listened to old CDs left behind by the farmer. All country. She had always been relatively indifferent on the genre. Listening to it during that trip reminded her of a conversation she had in bed with her husband at some point before he was her husband, or even her fiancé. Got this new guy at work, and he's just all about country music, said her boyfriend. It's weird. Why is it weird? Lots of people listen to country. Yeah, well, it's not like, it's not like weird that he listens to country. It's, how crazy he is about it, I guess. You guess? Like, he takes it too far? That, kind of thing? Yeah, like that. Like, the boots and the belt buckle and the full nine. Like, we're not rustling cattle, man, you know? He had said the last part with a horrible rendition of a stereotypical hick accent. This drew a chuckle from her. I hear you, partner. But you, get what I mean, right? Well, some people are, just like that. Remember, what was his name, in high school with the multicolored mohawk? Tyler! Yes, Tyler. So you like punk music. Cool, bro. Do you really need to build your entire personality around it? You know? He said nothing. Or motorcycle people, she continued. Hey, you like riding your motorbike. Cool, I'm happy for you. But then you go and make it your whole personality, and I'm not sure. Well, why? Right. Yeah, I guess. But those are both so, underground or whatever. The country thing is pretty huge. I guess. I mean, yeah, I guess maybe it is a little different with a subculture. Yeah. How do you feel about country? He asked. Indifferent. Really? Yeah. Why? I feel like everyone has a strong opinion on it, one way or the other. Not me. I just think it's whatever. Yeah? Well, I hate it. She laughed. Why? I don't know. It's just, it sucks. It sucks. She laughed again. Fair enough. The memory of this story made her cry a little. At that moment, she was driving through what was once Illinois, the southern part, far from Chicago or any of the suburban sprawl that surrounded it. It was basically a different state. Empty fields that had once been farmland stretched out for miles in all directions. There wasn't another living soul on the moonlit road. She hadn't seen another person in quite some time. She knew she would probably never see her husband again, but if had survived, he would do what she was doing, go home. If he didn't, at least she would have the memories to keep her company. All told, it took 2 nights to reach the gated community where she and her husband had lived before all this mess. She drove through the night, then pulled off the road, found someplace secluded, and slept during the one day. She was even sure to find and secure a treasure before leaving, a bobblehead of a pre-mix-up professional baseball player. She siphoned gas into a gas can she had found in the farmer's garage as needed, always from an abandoned car. Upon arriving at her old home, she would receive her true introduction to the new world and find her calling within it. The gated community in what used to be North Carolina, where she and her husband had lived, was in the early stages of being turned into a settlement by the time she pulled up. "State your business or turn back," said the person in the man's body, pointing an assault rifle at her. It wasn't just any man's body. It was the body that had once belonged to her neighbor, Tim, down the street. She had to remind herself that he was Tim in body only. "I live here," she told the guard in Tim's body. "Bullshit. I knew everyone who lives here." He cocked the rifle. "No, I mean, I live here." "No, you don't." "Damn it, not at the moment I don't, but I, literally live here. There's a house on the other side of that gate on Bradbury Street that's full of my possessions." He lowered the gun as the realization finally dawned on him. "You mean, yeah." After checking her weapons and submitting to a thorough pat-down, the person in Tim's old body introduced herself as Virginia, a 72-year-old retired school teacher from Naples, Florida, by way of Bar Harbor, Maine. "I was sitting on my front porch drinking a Jazz Cola and reading the Dewey Decimal System. Next thing I know, I'm a man sitting at a bar watching a college football game turn into a riot. Darndest thing." Sarah could tell instantly that she would like Virginia. She also knew that it would take her a while to get used to looking at Tim's body and not thinking of the man who always threw the best 4th of July parties. This was all assuming she would be allowed to stay. First, she had to meet Clarence. "He's our leader," said Virginia. "And quite a natural at it, too." Clarence was a career military man who was in his early 50s when things changed over. He was one of those who basically exchanged his large, muscular early 50s body for a younger model of the same make and different skin color. Once he gathered his bearings, he found some like-minded, peaceful English speakers and set about forming a community. At first, he was skeptical of bringing new people in. It hadn't been easy finding and vetting the 26 he already had. The first thing Sarah did to intrigue him was tell him about how the neighborhood was her home. When asked to prove it, she led him to the house on Bradbury that she had shared with her husband. She told Clarence and some of his lieutenants the address and described the exterior with great detail long before it was in view. When they arrived at the house, she provided a description of the interior. When Clarence saw that everything was as she described, he felt obligated to let her live in her new home. After all, he imagined only a very small percentage of the people would get that opportunity in this strange new world. How could he live with himself if he denied it of someone? He had no desire to ever attempt to return home to Oregon, but he admired Sarah for taking the risk. While looking around the house, Clarence was stunned by all the random items filling various shelves. Eventually, he noticed the diploma on the wall, one of the rare pieces of wall that wasn't covered by shelves. It was easy to miss amongst the madness that filled the room, but there it was, a framed diploma from a medical school, and had Sarah's name on it. "You're a doctor?" She nodded, and it was settled. There was a lot to be excited about with this initial crop of 26 residents, including himself. But one thing missing was a doctor. Now they had one. As the years passed, the community known as Craftburg became something of an unofficial capital for the new civilization that was being formed up and down the eastern portion of what used to be the United States. The official capital, of course, being Destiny. It had been named Craftburg by its leader Clarence for his mother, whose maiden name had been Craft. Clarence was a natural leader. He had a gift for bringing people together and putting them in the proper environment to maximize their abilities. Sarah always respected that about him. She became the settlement's first doctor. For many years, its only doctor. Eventually, more would come. But for the longest time, she handled all the medical needs. She was as vital to the health and safety of the settlement as anyone, perhaps more than anyone. Her old neighbor, Tim's body, wouldn't be the only familiar one she saw. For the first year or two, it seemed like every day she saw a familiar face that now housed an unfamiliar mind. The instinct to call out that person's name was ever present at first. Over time, it faded, and she accepted that she no longer knew those people in the same way she once had. Living in the house she had once shared with her husband remained strange no matter how much time had passed. Not only because he was gone and likely dead, but because she wasn't herself. She was living in the body of a man, something she would never get used to. Seeing all the old pictures of herself in her real body and her husband served as constant reminders of what she lost. Yet she never considered getting rid of them. There were things she liked about the man's body, namely the extra height and physical strength. She had been 5'4" and thin in her old body. Being 5'11" and capable of bench pressing more than 200 pounds wasn't something she took for granted. The new body hadn't been in the best shape when she inherited it, but she put in the work and eventually got it to its peak physical form. She still preferred the original model, wherever it was. The thing she hated most about being in a man's body was the parts. No matter how many times she looked at it or had to use it, it just wasn't right. This was a common refrain from people who found themselves in unfamiliar territory post-mix-up. Sarah would know, since it was among the complaints she heard most in her duties as Kraftberg doctor. Despite her discomfort with the new vessel, she recognized how lucky she was. She could have dropped into the body of a 90-year-old or a 9-day-old. She could have dropped into the body of someone on a plane just before it crashed like the one on the farm, or someone in a car on the expressway like all the crashes she saw on her drive. She could have been dropped onto the other side of the world. Instead, she bounced a few states over into the body of a strong, healthy man who was harmlessly sitting on the couch out in the country. She could live with that. The saddest part of being in their old house was the absence of him and reminders of him. He had been her husband for all of maybe 5 hours before everything changed over. That was her big personal tragedy. Waiting all those years to get married, then barely getting to enjoy it. He was the reason she had made the drive to Kraftberg and why she remained there more than 15 years later. Their old agreement. Once upon a time, they had gotten separated during a night out. Due to a dead cell phone battery, they couldn't communicate. Eventually, she went home, charged her battery, and called him. After the dust settled, they made an agreement that any time they got separated, they would just go home. No pass and go, just home. So that's what she did after everything changed over. And that was where she waited. Waited for the day a strange, unfamiliar body walked through the gate. Somehow, she would know it was him without having to say it. At least, that was how it went in her dreams. But as the hours bled to days, which bled to weeks, months, and years without his arrival, she began to lose her grip on hope. The odds of him both surviving and making it back have to be like 1,000,000,000 to 1, said Virginia. They had remained close friends since the day Sarah arrived. After enough time had passed, Sarah managed to forget all about Tim and just see Virginia. Virginia had even managed to find new love in the new world. She always encouraged Sarah to do the same. Sarah had to remind her friend that she wasn't sure she could do that in her new man's body. It's not that hard. I got used to it. I did it. It was true. Virginia had been an old woman who jumped into a young man's body. She had connected with a gay man who jumped into a man's body. They made it work. Throughout all of it, Virginia confided in Sarah as she adjusted to it all. But it wasn't for Sarah. The only way she could fathom using her new body in a sexual manner would be if her husband came home. She liked to think that it wouldn't matter what kind of body either of them jumped into, that their love would transcend physical appearances. But truthfully, she had no idea, and she preferred not to dwell on it. It wasn't until the 9th year, when Sarah left the settlement for the first time since arriving. Once Clarence learned she was a doctor, he deemed Sarah too important to risk letting her beyond the boundaries. Rarely was she even allowed to leave the walls of the gated community she lived in, usually only for medical emergencies. Kraftberg had grown a lot by that time, expanding well beyond the borders of the gated community Sarah had called home before the mix-up. The gated community had essentially become command central for the settlement, where all the most important people lived and where the vital offices, such as the hospital and settlement hall, were located. During those early years, there had been no logical reason for Sarah to risk leaving the safety of those walls. Things had changed. Over the past few years, the transatlantic route between Wavebreak and Portstown had been established. With it came English-speaking Americans who wanted to return to their native land, now commonly known as New America. Although the Eastern Territory where Kraftberg resided was specifically known as the New Eastern America Territory, or EA for short. These new arrivals scattered in all directions. As one of the most secure and established settlements in the EA, Kraftberg became a destination for many who wanted to live in New America but couldn't return to their pre-mix-up home, namely those who had resided in major cities or unclaimed places further west that fell outside of the current territory. Soon, Kraftberg was teeming with brilliant minds and strong bodies, people who had done big things in the old world and were now working together without bureaucracy or red tape getting in the way. There was real hope for a better world than the one they had all lost. Kraftberg also now had an entire team of doctors, with Sarah firmly entrenched as head physician. This was when she saw and seized her opportunity to not only finally get beyond the walls of the capital, but beyond the borders of the settlement. Clarence still didn't like it. Absolutely not. You're too important. The soldiers and scavengers will protect me. Don't you trust them? It's not that I don't trust them. It's that I can't afford to risk losing you. That's sweet, but I need to get out of here, even if only for a few hours. Eventually, he relented. The scavenging party she traveled with had been doing it since the early days. Even after all this time, there was still no shortage of abandoned towns, subdivisions, isolated farms, factories, warehouses, stores, and other buildings within range of Kraftberg. Over the years, dedicated scavenging teams had been working their way through each and picking them clean of any item they could prove useful. The abundance of items gathered during these scavenge runs had led to Kraftberg opening the Kraftberg Market in year 6, similar to the flea markets, the farmers' markets, swap meets, and shopping malls of the old world. The Kraftberg Market became known as a place where someone could trade anything for just about everything. It was one of the reasons traveling merchants were always sure to stop by Kraftberg. The market had brought a new brand of economy to the settlement. With it came new residents and an army that rivaled any on the continent, maybe even the New World. Even though Kraftberg was not the capital of the new Eastern America territory, it was a power. Sarah's addition to the scavenging party for this run wasn't just her. Clarence ordered extra security detail to assure her safety. This meant 5 extra soldiers, all assigned specifically to her. She wasn't allowed to leave their sight, not even to use the bathroom. She didn't mind going in front of people, though. After all, even after nearly a decade in it, she still couldn't think of it as her body. She didn't think of the new parts as private. Aside from getting beyond the borders for the first time, Sarah wanted to do some scavenging for herself. Back in the old world, she and her husband, although this was before they were married, loved going to flea markets, rummage sales, and the like in search of what they liked to call treasures. The house had been filled with them. They lined the shelves of vintage bookcases that had also been acquired on these trips. One of the first times Sarah felt happiness again after the great mix-up was when she walked into her house for the first time and saw that all the treasures were exactly as she and her husband had left them before going off to get married. She had wasted no time in adding the old war medals and bobbleheads to the clutter. Thanks to the market, she had added plenty more over the years. In fact, when scavenging parties returned from their trips, she was usually given first look at the haul and was allowed to take anything she wanted that didn't have true value. This was one of the perks of being the settlement's first doctor. After all, she had treated every member of each scavenging party at one time or another, many times for most. They were always happy to show their appreciation. The one thing she hadn't done since settling in Kraftberg was get out into the world and do some treasure hunting for herself. It was weird going through the dark and dusty long abandoned houses and taking things that weren't meant to be hers. On the way there, she had thought it would be like an estate sale, where you would enter the home of someone who has recently died, rummage through their things and buy what you want, then move on with your life. But estate sales had always been done with the explicit permission of the deceased heirs. No one had granted her and the scavenging party permission to enter any of these houses. There was no one left to do so. They did find people living in 2 of the houses, and they weren't friendly. All had to be put down, and were done so with 0 casualties or even injuries to the scavenging party. After all, they were pros. Happens more often than I like to think about, one of the scavengers told her. Usually, if anyone's out all alone or in small numbers in one of these places, they're not worth saving. They know their job, she thought. She could never do it. Kill people like they're insects. Her purpose was to heal, not hurt. By the time the trip ended and they were all on their way home, she had filled 3 bags with treasures, all sorts of good stuff that would fit nicely on the already overstuffed shelves packing every corner of the house. Everything she didn't take, the scavengers took. All of it was loaded onto the wagons to be brought to the market. As ridiculous as it had begun to sound, Sarah still clung to the dream of one day showing all the new treasures to her husband. Gardening was the biggest new hobby she had taken up since settling in Kraftwerk. There was no point in large, empty grass lawns in the New World. Space that was protected and safe from outside threats was at a premium and had to be utilized. So she started a garden in the 4th year. By the 15th year, it had overtaken the entire yard. She grew everything she could, all food. Kraftwerk had its own official farmland that grew enough to feed the entire settlement with plenty left over for trading. As a result, Sarah was able to keep everything she grew for herself. She still shared plenty, but there was a real joy to eating something she had planted and cultivated with her own hands. It was hot that day in July, something she was used to. Julys were known to burn hot in what used to be North Carolina. She was simultaneously assessing and watering her crop. Still plenty of time until harvest, one of her favorite times of the year. She couldn't wait to sink her teeth into this year's crop throughout the winter. While examining a particularly delicious-looking batch of tomatoes, she heard the gate squeaking as it opened. There were too many plants between her and the visitor for them to see each other. She had to navigate her way through those plants like an explorer pushing through a jungle. After nudging the last leaves from her path and reaching daylight, she found herself face to face with someone in the body of a woman who looked to be in her late 30s. She was standing on the walkway a few steps inside the gate with a look on her face that was a mixture of wonder and exhaustion. Sarah had never seen this woman before. It only took a glance to see that she was once very beautiful, in the old world, when the body's original owner still inhabited it. The person who had been residing in it for the past 15 years had clearly not been too concerned with keeping up appearances. This strange person in a woman's body stood still at the edge of what was left of the yard, silently staring up at the house like it was the glass of water waiting for them after a long walk through the Sahara. Whomever this was, they had been there before. That was when it hit Sarah. A lightning bolt of realization that struck her heart and coursed throughout every cell of the man's body she had spent the last 15 years living in. She dropped her watering can. It made a loud thud as it connected with the dirt and fell to its water pouring out into the thirsty soil. This got the person in the woman's body's attention and broke them from their trance. Sarah now found herself face to face with this person as they silently took each other in. Could it really be? She thought. It has to be. The stranger hesitated for a moment. Sarah took note of their mouth beginning to open, then stopping. They then reached into their pocket. Normally this would cause Sarah to put her guard up, pull her gun. This time she knew better. Instead, she stood still and watched as the stranger removed an old miniature metal souvenir sculpture of the Eiffel Tower from their pocket and held it out for Sarah to see. A treasure. Tears began to flow from Sarah's eye, yet she could neither move nor speak. She simply stood there looking at the man she had once loved and married. The man she had been waiting all these years for. It was him, but it also wasn't. He had been a handsome, masculine man in the old world. What stood before Sarah now was a small, frail, broken-down-looking woman. She had always believed that she would continue to love him no matter what body he inhabited. As she stared at his new body, she reminded herself of this. She caught his eyes and noticed them taking her in the same way hers were him. The woman he had fallen in love with had been a short, fit woman, not a large, burly man. He smiled, a shy, icebreaker smile that revealed several missing teeth. He must have noticed her looking at the spaces where those teeth used to be, because he smashed his lips shut faster than he had pulled them apart. He looked away, a sorrowful look that let her know that the story behind his missing teeth was a painful one. Finally, unable to stand the tension any longer, she opened her mouth. Chris? The sound of the name caused him to gasp and jump almost imperceptibly. He struggled to speak for a beat before eventually getting the words out. Sarah? Neither moved. There was no rushing to each other and collision of bodies like when a soldier returns home after war. Instead, there was only the stillness and silence of two people who had once known each other, but no longer did. Two people who had once loved each other, yet neither was sure if they could ever love anyone again. We hope you have enjoyed this unabridged version of Mixed Up World by Nick Sheptak, narrated by Joe Goodman. This program was executive produced by Nick Sheptak, text copyright 2025 by Nick Sheptak, production copyright 2025, all rights reserved.